So welcome to all of you to another Four Pees Café. We actually have no idea how long this is going to take, so you're going to discover this together with us. That's always fun. This is a Four Pees Café, meaning a couple of things. First of all, it is going to be recorded, so you are going to find it on our YouTube page. If you aren't subscribed to our YouTube page, and then you have to tick bells and stuff these days. I think I'm too old for that stuff, but if you haven't done that, do that. It would be good. What it also means is that you can speak up. That will mean that you have to unmute yourself, but that should not be too difficult. And we actually actively encourage participation. This is one of those cases where we are going to have multiple speakers. Hello, Michiel. And so if you want to speak up, if you have questions, please just do so. Our intention for this session, just so you know as well, was to create something where we go over terminology. And actually, I think I have a slide for this, so maybe I should start doing slides and then we will get to what we're going to talk about. There is also a chat window. Last administrative thing, there is a chat window. So if you have questions, but you are too shy to speak up, then type your question in the chat. And one of us, namely Michiel, will keep an eye on that and will ask your question. We can handle a few languages, but don't go overboard with that. We have no one for Russian, Chinese, or any of the other fun languages out there. So let's see if we can get started. There we go. I knew I had a slide with the program for today. So what we're going to talk about is terminology. That is the first thing. And the reason for this session is that every so often I have a discussion or we have discussions with people about imposition. And one of the first things you normally have to do is set the record straight on what kind of terminology you are using. And that doesn't mean that what we are using and saying is necessarily correct. But I think we've done our best to find generally accepted terminology. So we want to go over that first of all. And then secondly, we wanted to go over some of the products that we happen to know and give you an overview of what the capabilities of these things are. And then at the end, we'll have a very short conclusion and then maybe some discussion with some of you on, so what are you supposed to be using if you're, if you have a problem? What are your options? That this is useful, we discovered while making this, because at least one of the software products that we're going to talk about uses the terminology differently than what we think is the accepted way of doing so. So, but we'll explain as we get to that. So, Michiel, why don't you introduce yourself so that we are officially with two who can speak?
Hi, I'm Michiel. I will also speak. Yeah, most of you probably already know me. I've been hosting a few of the Four Pees Cafés as well. I do technical support at Four Pees, and yeah, I probably answered some questions before. So I'll be trying to support David, let's say, during this one.
Very nice. I saw what you did there. So, and then I think most of you should know me by now. I am the CTO of Four Pees. I've this year discovered that I've been working with PDF for over 25 years now, which is a very painful realization in a way, but yeah, PDF automation, standardization, everything that has to do with that. And let's get the show on the road, shall we? So let's start with the terminology. And I've looked for something to, but the most generic concept. And I think the most generic concept is imposition. Now, I already get tripped up every time because I never know whether to write imposition or imposing, or the verb is to impose, of course. And what you see on your screen is exactly what imposition is. Yeah? I have a business card. I can design that business card. It is 5 by 7 centimeter. And then I can give that business card to Michiel, who is my printer, and he has to print it. But I'm guessing that you don't have a machine that is 5 by 7 centimeter, right?
I don't even have any paper to put in that machine that is exactly that size.
Yeah.
So what I'll try to do is I'll take that card and I'll just, instead of printing 2,000 of those cards one by one, I'll put them together and I'll print on the paper that I do have in a size my machine can handle.
And what you see there could be a digital print machine, I guess. It's an A3, so that would kind of make sense. Not sure it would be A3, it might be a slightly different format, but something like that is actually quite plausible. And then you could fit a bunch of cards on there. And that process of going from a 1-up to an n-up, if you want, is typically called imposing, and you get an imposed sheet as a result. And then there are some specific ways of doing this, or some terminology that talks about subsets of what you encounter during imposing stuff. And this is not going to be complete. There are so many things that you encounter during imposition that we can't explain everything, but I wanted to highlight some of the basic stuff perhaps. So again, I have this business card, I give it to Michiel, and one of the things he can do is step and repeat, right?
Yeah. So with step and repeat, what we would do is just take the 1-page document we have and copy it over a certain amount of times horizontally, a certain amount of times vertically to fill a sheet up. And typically you would try to just fit as many as possible on a specific sheet, or put them a certain distance apart depending on how you're cutting them out later. So if you have a die for it that is already a repeat, you would put them in that way that they fit with the die.
So it might not be, what I did here might not be the most efficient way of doing it. Let's put it this way, but I just said, let's have 3, what is that then? Columns and 6 rows. And so we fit 18 of these business cards on a sheet.
And intelligently, if the business card had a backside, you would have a second page that is the same layout, but with all the back sides. So you could print your sheet recto verso and have a proper match for both sides.
Yeah, and that's actually a good remark, because what we noticed is that if you go over the software that can do this, there is actually software that has no problems with doing some of these things with one-sided jobs, but can't do the same thing with double-sided jobs. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're also going to want to do double-sided jobs. But we'll get back to the software after that. Now, this could be the next step. And again, this is a very generic term. And we wanted to put it on here because it often gets confused with other stuff. But other than step and repeat, I could try to be more clever and do sheet optimization. And then you get something that looks like what you have on the right there. So this is not strictly any more rows and columns, but you can fit more of these things on one sheet. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, this one. And you do get more on them. I actually, I verified, because I thought, well, you can fit 21 on this one. And it was, I think, 18 for the step and repeat one. So this is actually smarter.
I totally wasn't just counting them to make sure.
I know you were. But this is also where you see the what you said before, the double-sided bits. On the previous one, if it's a step and repeat, it's not difficult to do the backside as well. I mean, it's just step and repeat in both cases. But for this one, you would already have to be careful, right?
Yep. And this is where one of our applications has a bit more difficulty with a normal step and repeat, where you have identical margins and you have equidistant files. It's very easy to just take the other page, do the same thing because they're the same size, and the margin and everything would just work themselves out. Here you see that if it's one way or the other way, it makes a big difference because you want your horizontal files on the other side for the back of the paper.
Yeah. And also what you have to realize, and this is not always clear because we are humans and we don't understand always how computers work and algorithms, but there is an enormous step in complexity going from a simple step and repeat to this. From a computational point of view, finding an optimization like this is not, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. And doing it as good as possible is a bit of a challenge. So some of the software we'll talk about can easily do the step and repeat bit, but once you ask it to find the best way to fill a sheet, it becomes a lot more difficult.
Yeah, and this becomes even more complex when we go to the next slide. And we talk
Yes.
about documents that have different sizes.
Exactly. Now, here is where the terminology is going to clash at some point when we talk software, because the view we have on this is that ganging is the process of taking multiple files together and putting them on a larger sheet. And that's the example that we have there. Yeah. And as Michiel said, now you have different size things you have to put together, and calculating what the best way is to do that is not certain. I'm not sure I did it. I didn't use software for this. I just tried to come up with something. So there might be a way to get more out of this sheet. I'm not sure. But so think of ganging as, instead of taking each job by itself, waiting until you have, for example, 10 jobs or 50 jobs in an incoming folder, and then trying to find the best way of putting them together on sheets. So there's a double problem from a computational point of view. The first one is, if I know that I have these two jobs, how do I put them on a sheet and put as many of them on there? But the secondary problem is, if I have 50 jobs, how do I select the ones that go on the first sheet so that it's filled as nicely as possible?
Yeah, and you can go further than that, that if you know how many of each job you have to have printed by the end, you might even make the gang that you're making more complex to end up with as little waste as possible of both jobs, while still reaching the amount you want to have of each job at the end of the run.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, even for fast computers, an absolutely not trivial calculation. I can guarantee you that. So let's make it even more interesting. If you, all the previous examples, we had rectangular jobs, and calculating something that is a rectangle, if everything is a rectangle, then it's quite easy. But if that is not the case, if you have jobs that have a cut contour, like the nice cyan line around these sushi penguin images, then the ways that you can put those together is, well, it gets very difficult now. And this is also not created by software. And right before we did this, Michiel pointed out that my die lines overlapped, or my cut contour overlapped for two of these. So it's not an easy thing to do. And what we see is that in many cases, this is still done in Illustrator. Someone will manually put these together in Illustrator.
Yeah, we often do hear that when we're talking about some of the products and we explain like the point of sale of it, and we discuss, hey, what are you doing now? Well, yeah, we have to manually open jobs and collect them ourselves to optimize our paper. And the amount of time that person spends on it is one thing, but also the effort that they have to do to put stuff together, and then whether or not they actually get the most efficient result is another whole thing.
Exactly. So this is nesting. That is the term I hear most people use it, and some of my American friends insist that you have to say true shape nesting, but I think both will actually work and describe the same process. It's taking jobs that have a cut contour and putting them together and in a nice way. And we're again simplifying. There are a bunch of parameters here that you might have to take into account. Like I think two of my cut contours might come too close together for certain applications.
Yeah, these are also easy penguins, right? Because none of them have bleed. If you have bleed, then you will need to have a margin outside of your cut contours to accommodate that bleed. And then you can go further. And if you have, for example, images that repeat, where they have a footer, for example, then you don't have to have that margin for that bleed, because if you cut in half the margin space, you still have the same bleed colors, so it doesn't have any problem there. So, but that I'm not sure if any of our apps do that kind of stuff automatically, but that's something that you can keep in mind if you make these optimized builds of.
You mean the overlap of the bleed and figuring out where and how it should overlap?
Like the fact that they have to keep margin and stuff like that, sure, I know that the apps can do that, but if it's okay to have an overlap because it's a similar color, I don't know if Imp can do that, for example, or there is a tool.
At least partially, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's discuss some other things that make sense, but that we don't have a complete separate slide for. And the first thing is, I think all the examples we gave so far are unbound jobs. Yeah, and unbound jobs are kind of simple in a way. You also have bound jobs, things like books or magazines. And if you start talking about bound jobs, there's going to be a lot of other parameters that you have to take into account. The rectangular versus irregular jobs is one that we did talk about. So I'm going to skip that one. You want to say something about binding methods?
I was thinking about the bound versus unbound jobs already, but binding methods kind of ties into that.
It ties into that, yeah.
Yeah, once you have, for example, a book, you don't print them page by page, of course. You print a sheet that you then fold in a certain order, and then you have multiple of those folded sheets that you signatures that you glue together or stitch together or in some way handle. And the way that you bind the tool, and whether you use stitches or glue or whatever, makes the way that you fold your page different, which makes the order of the pages on the sheet that you're imposing different. And if you click again for the next line of text, part of with the binding method is that if you make a signature, the pages on the inside of the signature will be pushed more outwards while the outside pages aren't. So you'll have a slight different in positioning of your pages, and the creep, the shingling you have, is to take that into account to move your pages on the outside of the signature slightly further apart than those on the inside, so they end up at the same height when you fold it and afterwards want to cut it. So all of that has an influence on how you want to build your imposition.
Yeah, and if you wouldn't do that, you would have a book, and if you flipped through the pages, you would see the text margin move slightly depending on where you are in the book, and you probably don't want that.
Yeah, and that also depends on your paper thickness, so your material comes into account there as well.
So once you start thinking about what software do I want, the fact whether you want to do bound or unbound or both is, again, one of those things that can make, well, it can make a lot of difference because some software simply doesn't know how to handle these things. Sheets versus rolls. I think that is also one of these things. And that is that the example we gave for the imposition is that you take jobs and you put them on a larger sheet. Of course, it's not always going to be sheets. If you've ever seen an image of a newspaper press, the very big ones, those are rolls of paper. But also, if you go to even much smaller, I think, of the large format printers these days, very often those will also use rolls as medium, correct?
Yes, a lot of the digital printers use rolls now, partly because it goes away from the size limit. You can basically have a roll of a certain width and 30 meters of length. So then you can print bigger jobs by just turning them landscape if you want to. I think the sheet types, when you look at large format printing, are actually more rare and are typically used when you're using hard substrates that you can't put on a roll, like when you're printing on plexiglass or cardboard or stuff like that.
Die bond plates and stuff like.
And then you end up with a size of like 3.5 by 2.5 meters or stuff like that, because you have to limit yourself to what you can reasonably put into a room.
Yeah. Now, what fascinates me, because I have a bit of a mathematical background, what fascinates me is how much more difficult that is for a computer to calculate that. If you have a sheet, you know what the size is that you're aiming for. It's going to be A3 or any other format, but you know you have to fit stuff on that size. If you have a roll, that's no longer the case. You know what the width is, but most of these machines can do, especially the large format machines, can do variable cutoff. So you could generate something that is, what would be a minimum, like 30 centimeters for many of them?
I think if I were to print something on the printer we have in the office, which is an Epson Stylus Pro 7900, I could print as little as 5 centimeters and it wouldn't care.
Okay.
I can just print anything that it would start printing, and I think it has like a small margin to get started of like 1 or 2 centimeters, and then it can cut off when it's done.
Okay.
So the minimum length is really, really small, I think.
Yeah, and maximum length, I know of customers that have things, the whole roll. But the problem is that you shouldn't only look at the machine in that case. You also have to look at
the finishing.
Finishing and what the RIP can handle. Both.
Yeah. Actually. So for the RIP, I guess it depends on the RIP itself, but specifically for Caldera, what we're doing, I know when they went to version 12 2 or 3 years ago, they changed their file size limit essentially from 2 gigabytes to like 50 gigabytes. And I think if you're throwing a PDF at it with vectors, you'd have to have a ridiculously huge file to get to 50 gigabytes. If you're running huge images that you want to print on banners, obviously you'll reach that limit a lot faster, but you're unlikely to print 50 meters of that in one go anyway. I think the finishing is more of a limiting factor, because if you print your entire roll and then you want to cut that entire roll, you need to have a cutting machine that is able to handle essentially that entire roll as one thing, instead of like putting pieces of it on a table to laser it out, because you won't be able to do that.
So if you're using one of those Zoom tables that take a sheet,
then I guess you would have to limit yourself to the table size.
Yeah.
While if you have a Summa plotter that does cutting, then you could put on the roll, and with the Summa barcode that you have, the little Opus code, you can even automatically detect which job you are currently at on the roll, take that from the cutting server, cut that one, and then when it detects the next job, it can take that one. So you can automatically have it cut your entire roll of jobs at one go.
So it is something that makes the whole thing more complex, and again, something to take into account as we're looking at things. And this is it's linked, but it's not linked in a way. It adds a complication. Yeah. If Michiel is a printer and he prints on sheets, he probably doesn't just have one paper format, I would guess. You would have multiple, and the same with rolls. You would probably have rolls of a different width.
Oh, I have lots of those.
I don't doubt that. But that does mean That threw me off. That does mean that if you go to software and you ask the software to calculate the best way to put these jobs together, like to do sheet optimization, it's now has the problem that it has to, well, essentially has to calculate for 10 different sizes, for example, and then tell you what's going to give the best result.
It depends on your expectations, right? Like, I think the only tool that we're going to discuss here that actually does that is Imp, where you say,
Yes.
hey, I have options for you to decide which size of paper you want to use. Can you give me which one is the best option? I think in all the other tools, you're deciding it in advance and you're saying, okay, I'm going to work with this job for that format, and you have to calculate it for that format. And it's not doing the smart calculation of
which can be
which
fine.
paper is the best paper.
Yeah, and that can be fine, right? I mean, if the problem you want to solve is putting more jobs on a sheet and you don't have many different sheet sizes, or you know that you're always going to print on die bond and you have a certain size, fine, that is what you're doing. But if you know that you have lots of jobs that you can print on the same medium and you want to see which sheet is going to be the best, or whether it's best to print it on a sheet or a roll, for example, then you need software that can handle that.
I wonder at that point what the primary importance is, having the best sheet optimization or the best planning for your machines and papers. Because if you let the software pick, and it's probably going to pick one of the bigger paper sizes, let's be fair. If you have high quantity, it's going to pick a big paper size. But what if you have a smaller press? It's never going to run unless you make the software decide that, oh, the other one is busy, I have to use the smaller one, or you just tell it to use the smaller one.
True and not true. True, theoretically, absolutely. I think from a practical point of view, what you're going to see is that you have a certain collection of jobs, and you're right, especially for the initial jobs, the larger paper sizes are probably going to be favored because there are more combinations. But once you start running out of jobs, you're going to have jobs that you need to get on something. And in that case, the smaller paper sizes might be much better because you're not going to fill them up and you're going to waste less paper like that, less medium.
And then your imposition tool is tying in very much with your customer job management system, where you have to look at everything and look at the whole picture and not just at like the one part of your process.
Yes, and I wanted to have one other one, but I think it's the oh no, I didn't add that one, did I? Okay, fine, we'll get to that. So yes, it ties in, and I do have it. It's here. It ties in, and it ties in with that, I believe. Yeah. If you look at things like sheet optimization in a vacuum by itself, just at that, then you can try to optimize it as much as possible. The problem is, you're probably going to make people in finishing very angry if you don't, if you do it without taking them into account. And that is something that you also need to think of that as you're doing it. If you impose every job by itself, you're not even doing ganging. You put every job by itself on a sheet. From a finishing point of view, that is probably quite easy, because you know where the job is and so on. If you don't do that and you start doing sheet optimization and you end up with something where different parts of an order are on different layouts, well, someone in finishing is going to have to put all of those back together, and that's not so easy. Yeah. So I think this is one of the, you can look at the software and what the software can do and so on, but I think we shouldn't forget that there is also an overarching management part to this, where you have to look at the whole company and see what influence is this going to have on the rest of my business. Okay, so we kind of skipped this multiple presses and job quantities thing. I think this job quantities is what you already mentioned, right?
Yeah, I think I touched on that somewhere at the beginning, and we kind of touched on multiple presses when we talked about paper sizes. But it goes a bit further than that. Of course, you also have ink options. You have color gamut options. It depends on what you prioritize and how you handle everything, I guess.
Yeah, and then that is something that we see in projects very often as well, is that you can say, oh, we have many jobs and we want to put them all together and we want to do sheet optimization. But again, if I think about large format companies, very often they always print certain jobs on certain machines. So it's not like they are totally interchangeable. And that is an extra parameter that you have to take into account. You don't have the liberty on printing those on every machine. Certain jobs will have to go to certain machines, and that's it. Yeah. So again, don't just, it goes back a little bit to this. Should have put a different title on this perhaps, because it's more about the whole print management process now that I come to think of it. Than simply these different factions fighting each other.
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit in the color management cafes that I did a while ago. You have multiple presses, you have multiple options, but if you have, for example, both digital and offset presses, and you want to have jobs for both, it'll depend on both the quantity of the jobs you want to do, what your finishing expectations are. If you want to, for example, print a finishing color like a varnish or a undercolor white or whatever that a digital machine can do for your offset press, that would be harder because you would have to have an extra printing tower with that spot color in there. And also the gamut, the color gamut that you have, if you have jobs that have needs of the expanded gamut, then you might want to use a digital printer to print those, and you can't reproduce that color on your offset press. So when that job comes in again, even if it's a way bigger quantity, you'll probably still want to print that one on the digital printer just to have the same color result as you had the first time you printed that job.
Yeah. So looking at the capabilities of the software, I think is important, but we should probably start by looking at what are what do you want in your company, not just from this this process, where does it fit in? And that's for most processes, I guess, in the whole chain. Where does it fit in? What are the limitations that you have? What are the things where you think you can take advantage, and so on and so on.
As usual, it's not just about a tool.
No, absolutely not. And one of the good examples that we run into a lot is that if someone says we want to gang jobs together, well, you're going to need a tool that can gang them together, and that is probably going to be more expensive than a tool that doesn't do that and does a simple step and repeat. And then the question becomes, how many jobs per day do you do? And do you have enough jobs that the gangs that you calculate are going to be significantly better? Because if you don't, then what's the point, right?
And what information do you have? The system that you're using is going to need to know which jobs to gang together. And again, if you want to have an automated process, then you have to make sure that that process has all the information it needs to do what you want it to do.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we very often say as well, is that standardization begins automation. You need to standardize stuff first, and if you don't do that, then it is very, very difficult to automate the tasks afterwards. Also, in most, I think, of the solutions that we are going to talk about, there is an assumption that the PDF files that you get are going to be good. Yeah, take that into account. So if you start looking at Imposition, it's not the Imposition software. Well, in most cases, it's not the Imposition process. I'll say it like that. It's not the Imposition process that is going to check the quality of your files. Yeah, the software that you're using might be capable of doing that. But you will still have to do it. And most Imposition software assumes that the files are going to be good. So you'll have to make sure that you have pre-flight in front of it, and that the dimensions are correct, and that everything else in these files is correct before you go to the imposition step, or you're going to end up with sheets that don't print at the end, which is...
More than an assumption that the file is correct, the imposition might actually rely on certain parts of the file to be correct. You will need proper page boxes, for example. If you want to use the contour lines, you will need proper contour lines in a recognized color. Stuff like that is also important, even beyond just having a proper PDF.
Yeah, and there are, with my standards hat on, there are some ISO standards that aim at making some of these things easier. For example, recognizing the die lines or the cut contour or die line, whatever you want to use. Not just looking at the name of them, but looking at metadata that is associated with them. But to be fair, in most cases, the software isn't going to support that yet. So in most cases, you're going to have to make sure that the spot color names for cut lines, for example, are correct. Okay. So this is not imposing, is it?
Well, it's kind of the opposite of what we did before, right? So before you put the small ones together on a big sheet, here, for practical reasons, you have to make a big sheet into small sheets. I'm still going to call it imposing, because what you're doing is you're making a file, you're changing a file to different sheet sizes to make it work for you. So I'm still going to call it imposing.
Well, to make it interesting, in many cases, tiling and imposing is going to be done sequentially, or might be done sequentially. You might first cut it up in pieces and then put those pieces together in some way on a larger sheet in order to produce them as efficiently as possible. Of course, in this example, it wouldn't be a sheet that is larger than 4x3, because then you can just put it on there and you're done. But if you want to print these things on a roll, it might be so that you have to cut it up in pieces, but that you can then somehow fit these pieces intelligently on the roll to save material. But you're right. This is well, on the one hand, it's not imposition, but it is very closely related to the topic, and it is going to be important that you realize which of the software can do this and which can't do that. Because if you need this, it is something to take into account in your software selection. Okay, so let's talk about some products here, and we're going to keep this relatively short. I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 slides of different products, something like that. We're going to keep it short and give you an overview. If you have questions or you want to ask more detailed things about something, then by all means do so. If you want to see some of these things in practice, we can set up demos for all of them. That's not the point, but we can't do 5 or 6 demos in a 1-hour slot. So we decided to not do any of them, and at least give you an idea of which products you should look at if you're looking for something in this imposition space.
Yeah, I think for most of them, we also already have demos probably specifically about imposition on our YouTube channel. Correct. So if you want to have a personalized demo for yourself with your files, just send us an email. We can totally do that. If you just want to technically see what it can do, there's probably already a video on our channel that explains it.
Yeah, for most of them, probably not all of them, at least not one of them, I think.
Yeah, at least not one of them. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. But so, like Michiel said, just get in contact, send an email, fill in a form on the website. It doesn't matter, just get in contact, and we can look at that. So I think this combination of pink and green is excellent, by the way. I made it myself. You can blame Four Pees Marketing, who came up with these nice color combinations.
I love the pink.
So let's start by talking about. I want to say one of the oldest, and I think I'm correct. It's probably about the same time as the imposition capabilities in pdfToolbox were added. But quite imposing, quite software goes along quite a while. It's difficult to talk about quite without using the word quite too often in sentences, but you'll have to forgive me for that. Quite is a plugin for Adobe Acrobat and a standalone application. Then it's quite hot imposing. And I think the advantages of the tool are that on the one hand, it's very easy to use. That was how it started out all that time in the past, is that it was very easy to use. It was a plugin for Acrobat, which was an environment everyone was familiar with to work with PDF documents. And it could do a whole range of very simple imposition tasks in Acrobat immediately. And that also allowed you to, and it still does, to visualize what you're going to get very quickly. Yeah. So a minimum of very complex setup, you might have many options, but that's very common to all imposition tools, I'm afraid. They all have many, many options. But a very visual and easy tool to work with. Doing things like, and you can see them here on the slide, so doing things like step and repeat and an NUP and a booklet. And we didn't really explain what NUP is, did we?
No, I was thinking about it, but we had the whole step and repeat thing happen, right? Where you have the same file being repeated on the sheet in multiple directions.
The columns and rows.
Yeah. So if you have that, but you have a multi-page document coming in, what NUP would do is, instead of repeating the same file, it would have each of those pages in sequence to fill up a bigger sheet.
So I send you a PDF file with 10 business cards, and that gets put, all 10 of them get put on one bigger sheet in order to print them.
Exactly, yeah.
So all of those things are supported here. The imposition scheme thing goes back to the discussion on bound jobs and how do you calculate the signatures and put them on there, and how are they going to be folded, and are they going to be glued at the end of, or is it stapling, or is it sewing, and all of those things. And then this is for, normally is for a rectangular job. So rectangular, but bound and unbound. Now, PDF files, of course, are always rectangular. That means that if you have a label and it has a cut contour, you could still do imposition with it with a tool like this by doing a simple step and repeat. And for some older equipment, that might actually be what you need to do because they don't support anything else. But so this is really towards those rectangular jobs. Think commercial print, not so much perhaps the large format stuff, but commercial print. What is also nice about this is that even though it's very easy to use, they also implemented over the years quite a few more advanced features that you can use, up to and including things like variable data to some extent. Yeah, so I think Quite got a reputation for being a very simple tool that people start with. In my experience, that is not always correct, and it can do more things than many people give it credit for. So certainly something to look at. I also listed negatives. This is very contentious always, and I know that. So you can blame Michiel and me for the negatives, more me than Michiel probably, but anyway, you can blame us for the negatives and you can disagree by all means. But the fact that it requires Acrobat, that it's a plugin for Acrobat, for me is a bit of a negative, and that is mostly because I don't like the Acrobat interface all that much anymore. But you have to put some negatives on there, so I listed that one. And the other thing I listed is a little bit more. Maybe it's already because I'm starting to compare what you can do with pdfToolbox, but it's imposition only, meaning this is a tool that you can use to create imposition. and that's also where it stops. And that is good from one side, because it means that it is very focused on creating imposition, but it is limited to that.
Maybe our expectation just got too high, because we have a lot of tools that can do a lot of things. So maybe we start having huge expectations of everything, while maybe an application that is specialized at something is still just as good, but specialized.
Yeah, but it depends on what you want. And I think at some point the question is going to be, what's the ROI of the tools? And what is then, looking at what I want to do in my company, what is the best tool for the job, right? But I can have high expectations. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And this is probably the reason that I added that to the previous slide, and I realized that it's the fact that if you're looking at pdfToolbox, there is imposition in there, but it can also do a lot of other things. And what we see actually in if we implement pdfToolbox is that sometimes people start using pdfToolbox to do pre-flight, and then they realize that there is an imposition engine in there, and that that they can use that as well. So that I think that is one of the strengths of this tool, is that you can use it for so many different things in a workflow that from a return point of view, well, that's a good thing. You've made imposition configurations, I think, with pdfToolbox. Would you agree that the no easy template editor is listed as a negative?
I was going to counter your negative again. I agree that the way to create custom impositions in Toolbox isn't easy. You have to know what you're doing to get it right. Once you know what you're doing, I don't think it's incredibly complex either. The big advantage of not being limited to what you could do with any kind of interface you create to have a template is that with the Toolbox imposition, you can do pretty much anything you can set your mind on when they're talking about putting a page on another page in any shape, way, or form. So yes, you have to know what you're doing, but that's true for a lot of things. But I agree that it's not an easy template editor that we have right now.
Yeah, if those of you listening who haven't used this, what you basically have to do is you have to make 2 text files that use some format that was invented by probably someone who is in this call, if I saw it correctly, 25 years ago, and that is some form of tab-based text file.
And I always get it wrong. I still always get something wrong that makes me have to re-look at my files.
That was going to be my point. You need to be really, really careful, or you will forget one tab somewhere, and then pdfToolbox is going to tell you, yeah, I can't do that.
It's not even the tab. I don't even know what's wrong sometimes, but I always have to reopen, check all my stuff to see if it's correct, and then resave it and try again.
Small steps. You have to do it in small steps. That is much better.
And sometimes you have the thing where Toolbox doesn't even open anymore when you have it wrong, and then you really have to play with it a bit.
Now, what it does from a functionality point of view, it does the kind of thing that Quite does. Although in Quite you do have ways to, for example, with user interface, visually say what kind of folding scheme you want and so on. And that is not something that you have with pdfToolbox. No way. But it does a number of easy ones, the step and repeat, the enup, a booklet. So that is one of those impositions for bound stuff that are then going to be folded. It supports imposition schemes for unbound and for bound jobs. But again, no editor, so you'll have to make the configurations yourself.
There is a bunch of them present already.
Yes.
Yeah, for standard formats, when you're talking A5, A4, A3, onto standard formats for bigger sheets, there is a bunch of them already present. They're named pretty accurately with what they're supposed to do. And in the end, imposition schemes by themselves are standardized. There is a whole list of standardized schemes that have names that do exactly what you expect them to do. So if you're familiar with it, you can probably just pick one that you know and use it.
Correct. And I can't say anything about future versions of the software, if those would even exist, but the fact that it's not always that easy to use is an attention point. Let's put it that way. So one other thing to mention here is that we added tiling at the top. pdfToolbox does allow you to do tiling as well, either pre-configured, so out of the box, just saying split this up in 5 pieces, or you can do more creative things with the imposition engine, like taking a large picture and transforming it into strips of wallpaper with correct bleed and stuff like that. So, and that is what I had on the green for pdfToolbox as well, is that it can be used for special projects. And that sounds like it's something for the CIA or whatever. It's not. It's just if you want to do something that is not possible with the product. And we had a project lately where we had to transform a file for wallpaper production, then this imposition engine comes in really, really handy. It can very nicely be integrated into tools like Switch, for example. You can even create the imposition configuration files on the fly because they're text files, so you can write them out with JavaScript and so on. That is a real advantage. But I also listed as a plus, because I think it in many cases it is that it doesn't only support hot folders. You also have the programmatic interface, whether it's command line or SDK, but you can also talk to it in that way.
Yep. Yeah, so another tool that we have that does many things to jobs on sheets and roles is calderaRIP. It doesn't do traditional impositioning, where we would say we have imposition schemes, and specifically it doesn't really do bound jobs because it's not meant for that. calderaRIP is more of a large format solution. So we're typically talking about unbound job, and we're also typically talking about irregular jobs when we're talking about calderaRIP. It's very good at step and repeat. You basically just because it starts from the printer, right? So you have your printer has a certain limit to what it can do. The driver knows that you're talking about rolls or sheets, so you can start from the width of the roll that you have on your printer and then fill it up left to right and top to bottom until you have your amount of things, and then send that amount of repeats to your printer and print the exact amount of penguins that you intended to print automatically, step and repeat on the roll. That's the easy way to do it. The exact same thing for ANUP, but then it just pastes the pages where you would normally have the single shapes. And then it has the nesting. What I talked about just now with step and repeat is for single files, right? You have one file of penguin and you put it as many times on the roll as you want. calderaRIP can also do nesting with contour shapes, so it can use those irregular shapes based on the cut contour spot color, and it can nest them together to get a combination of jobs on a single sheet. Mm-hmm. And that's configurable, so it's also hot folder based if you want it to be. It's configurable to say, okay, just collect all the jobs that come into that hot folder, put them on the same sheet for that printer, so a width of roll that is that size, and just collect them until you have like 5 meters of roll that is 80% filled. And then you can put it on into my actual spooler, rip it, and print it.
So then you should have the ganging thing on there as well, right? The ganging tag.
In what way do you mean ganging here? Like to collect them, or like
as in multiple jobs that we're going to put on one sheet?
Yeah. So that's what I just meant with the nesting, actually. But yeah, nesting and ganging. So all the jobs that come into that hot folder are put together on a sheet until it reaches the limit that you set it to do. Whether they're irregular or regular, that is fine. And then tiling is also possible. It actually contains a full tiling module where you can visually place where the lines for the cuts are. And this is actually interesting because when you talk about Toolbox, you would set a width for the tiles and it would create fixed width tiles. While in the Caldera tiling module, what you can do is you can load in an image as a backdrop, let's say the front of a building, and you can create tiles that are the width of each of the windows, skipping the parts of wall that are not window, and just having those areas not printed. And then you can print all of the stickers you want for your windows already cut into pieces and correctly sized for your windows of your shop. So that's a pretty cool editor. And then it automatically also is able to flip around every second tile, because with digital printers, you typically have a little bit of a color drift between the left and the right side of the printer. And if you print those bands the same direction and next to each other, you can sometimes see it go light to dark, light to dark, light to dark. And the gaps become kind of obvious. So what it does is it flips every second tile. So you go light to dark to light, and that gradation is not visible at all.
Yeah.
So on that end,
in the wallpaper project I talked about before, that was we did that. We had to do that as well.
yeah.
Every second page was flipped to avoid that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in Toolbox, of course, you can do that if you just create your configuration to rotate the tiles.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty much for calderaRIP. So you can do single jobs.
No template editor, no easy template editor, you say?
Yes and no. So the thing with calderaRIP is that it kind of works on the go. So you throw your files in there, and when you say step and repeat, for example, it'll try with the set margins you created to put as many as it can left to right. So typically what you'll see is you have a nice row of 3, and the fourth one that doesn't fit anymore is pushed down a little bit until it fits. So then you have 3 and a little bit of diagonal. So the next one is then going to go back to the left, and it's going to fill that up. So with step and repeat, it's going to do it that way, which means that if the margin or the file size changes, the way it puts it changes. With Nestomatic, it's more intelligent. It can actually mix stuff up to put a file that fits better in that spot instead. So it might do that automatically. Now, there is also the compose module, which is basically the manual editor to create a combined sheet where you say, I want 10 of these, I want 15 of those, and you can actually put them on there manually or have it automatically fill the sheets the way it wants to be. You have an option there to create a fixed layout. For example, if you're working with screen printing and you want to print phone cases or whatever, and you know that the layout of your printer is going to be 4 phone cases by 2 rows, and they're fixed because you have these places in your printer where you actually put your phone cases in a grid, then you know that you have to load your images into that grid. And you can create something like that where you say, okay, I want this image to be on this grid, and you can use a template editor to do that. But most of the impositioning, nesting, gagging is on the go depending on the files you drop into the system.
Okay, now what is interesting is that this is not the only Caldera product that we have on here. You also have PrimeCenter, and I'm assuming that it does something that is at least slightly different then.
Yeah, that means that I still won't shut up for a while. So yeah, we also have PrimeCenter, and PrimeCenter is fairly new. It's been around for a year now, I think. And it kind of picks in where calderaRIP had a big weakness. PrimeCenter, like I said before, when you're creating those nests and you're putting files together in calderaRIP, that wasn't completely optimized. It kind of fits it in as it goes. PrimeCenter is a lot more intelligent in the algorithm it uses to create a sheet optimization. So the strongest quality of PrimeCenter is that sheet optimization. It's able to have a really cool algorithm, rotate all the jobs by 1 degree, and calculate the best possible result of the files you drop into the system. But like we said at the beginning, it's nice if a tool is more than a one-trick pony and it can do something else. And PrimeCenter actually integrates pdfToolbox in technology. So you're able to do your pre-flighting in there as well, which means that you have one possibly automated tool that does, again, multiple things to create a really good result. And here, this is where we talked about the confusion with the terms as well, because PrimeCenter, specifically in the marketing talking points, we have nesting and gagging. But here they don't mean what we talked about so far. Nesting means sheet optimization, while gagging means grouping. And here you would use gagging to group jobs onto a sheet or onto a layout that you're creating based on a variable. So if you have multiple jobs coming in that have the same customer ID linked to them in metadata, then you can put all the files that are from the same customer onto the same sheet or onto the same layout and collect all the jobs for a separate customer on a separate layout.
Yeah.
Which is also an interesting feature, but it's just causing some confusion in how the terms are being used.
Cool.
And the weakness here is the fact that it doesn't have automated manual control. It's fully automated, which means that every time that you run the algorithm, you might actually get a different result because it's kind of acting as a bit of an AI, using the term very loosely because it's still an algorithm. It's not becoming more intelligent and going to make your printers attack you. It's still an algorithm, but if you run it twice, it might give you twice a different result. And the same weakness that we have here compared to calderaRIP is the way that the front and back side work. So when we talk about calderaRIP and PrimeCenter, and we're talking about recto verso files, the best we can really do is line all the files up to one side of the sheet. So everything aligned to the left for the front side and have it in a certain order. And then for the back side, align everything to the right in the same kind of layout. So they kind of match up, but that means that they're not automatically linked to front and back sides. You're kind of creating that yourself. So it's a work in progress when we're talking about stuff like that. It's not a priority though, because both applications are aimed at large format who typically don't do booklets or stuff where front and back is that big of a deal.
And just to clarify, this does not contain the RIP component, right?
No, PrimeCenter is purely a prepress tool. It's the output of PrimeCenter is a layouted PDF. So it's a big PDF document with your layout, with all your documents combined, that can be converted to a PDFX or Gantt workgroup standard and then dumped into the input hub folder for calderaRIP, for example, to work with it further. It doesn't have to be calderaRIP, it can be another tool, but the file that comes out is a PDF for print.
Yeah, cool. Okay, and then I think we have one tool left, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, last does not mean least. Actually, it's quite the opposite here. If you look from a functionality point of view, Imp is clearly in a completely different class of product. You can see that a little bit at the top. Well, it doesn't do tiling, but everything else it more or less does. It's simple. What kind of jobs? Yeah, whether they are rectangular or irregular or mixed, which is one of the nice things, that doesn't matter. It does bound jobs, it does unbound jobs, it does all kinds of different binding methods and so on. There really are no limitations. You can do ganging, you can do nesting for irregular jobs. You can do nesting where you mix irregular jobs with rectangular jobs, which is sometimes interesting and something that is not supported by a lot of software. And you can also mix bound jobs with unbound jobs. So it doesn't matter. You just give it a collection of jobs and it will do something with them. But I think the biggest thing that sets it apart is that where I think all the other tools that we talked about are focused on the process of making some kind of layout with your jobs. Imp has a very strong cost side to it as well. You set up in a library, you set up which presses you have or printers you have, what the technical parameters for those devices are, but also what their cost parameters are. And the same for materials. You give it a database of all the material that you have. And again, you specify the technical parameters like the width and the height, or the width of a roll, and the thickness and those kind of things. But you will also tell Imp what the cost of that material is per weight or per square meter or something like that. And because it has all that information, when you then ask it to plan a collection of jobs, it can make a whole bunch of combinations for you. So it can look at all the different sheet sizes, it can look at the different devices that you have, and it's going to tell you what the most cost-efficient way is to put things together. And that is something that none of the other tools we've talked about does. And of course, we're not saying that Imp is the only tool that can do that. I do know that there are other tools out there that do that. EFI Metrics is a good example of that. But it is kind of in the class of itself if you look at all the other tools that we've been talking about. So any job, any type of device, it has, in fact, it has LFP support in the sense that the algorithm to put stuff together is different for an LFP workflow than for commercial print workflows, for example. If someone asks you to print a flyer, whether you print 100 or 150 on an offset press, it's probably a low number for an offset press to begin with, but whether you print 100 or 150 is probably not going to be the end of the world. If someone asks you to print a banner, you want to print the number that they've asked you, not overshoot it by some ridiculous amount. So the algorithm is a little bit different depending on the market that you're in as well. So it takes advantage of technical and price parameters, and it does hot folder automation. I listed that as a negative, mainly because I don't know whether we have someone from Insoft here, but I will keep saying it. It would be nice to have a command line version or something with an API. So I listed this as a negative. What is cool about it is that in one of those hot folders, you can drop XML. So I can automate the whole process by creating an XML file that has my files, but also what I want to do in terms of imposition. And just dropping that into the hot folder. And Imp will read that XML, and it will use all of the instructions that you put in there. It looks for a solution, and then it writes out a plan XML file. And that XML can be used to figure out what kind of solution it came up with. And if you use this in, for example, a switch-based workflow, that means you can have XML in and XML out. Yeah. Still only hot folder based, but well. And then the other, and this is my favorite, well, not my favorite, my personal negative point about this, it's Windows only. So you will have to run this on a Windows machine. At the moment, I think Imp is the only reason I still have Parallels on my Mac, because, well, I have to.
Well, you lost me at no tiling. I know, I'm kidding, of course.
You can tile them ahead of time with pdfToolbox, and you do the imposition here. Maybe to finish that up, the ganging that you have here, I use that in the term that we defined in the beginning. So it's not like Caldera, where it means something else. Here, ganging simply means that you can either do one job and ask Imp to create an imposition out of it, or you can give it 2,000 jobs and ask it to create a good imposition out of it. So that's the ganging part. However, what Caldera calls ganging, and we call grouping, is also supported in Imp, and surprise, it's called grouping there. So both of these things are actually supported in there. So let's try to come to some kind of conclusion, and I think the conclusion is going to be very simple. And then if there are any questions, we'll look at those. So if you still think of questions, put them in the chat window. The conclusion is, and this is a slide to separate the people who are old enough from the people who are too young. If you know what this combination of a pen and what was that called on the right? Yes, a cassette. If you know what these two have to do with each other, then you're old enough to play with us. That's basically.
It's to replay the MP3 file on there.
It's to, yes, exactly, exactly. It's rewind, yes. So I think the only conclusion we can draw after all of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only conclusion we can draw is that you have to start by defining what you want to do, and not just the fact that you want to do imposition, but by defining what kind of jobs we're talking about, what quantities of jobs we're talking about per day, for example, how long you can wait to produce stuff. If you get 500 jobs per day, but you have to print them as they come in because otherwise you can't meet your deadline, then that is important information. So you have to look at all of these things, types of jobs, quantities, how your company is set up, the finishing aspects, the cutting aspect, all of these things, and then see, okay, so is there a tool that can handle all of these things? Do we need to look at different tools for different workflows? And yes, I realize that most people would like to avoid that, but sometimes it is unavoidable, or it's just smart to do it with different tools. But you need to look for the right tool for the job. And you can't just say, oh, you're in large format, you're gonna need, I don't know, PrimeCenter.
And the biggest, most expensive tool might not be the best tool for the stuff that you want to do. If you take everything David said into consideration and you look at your production limitations or what you want to do in your production area, or you don't have the setup right now to give all the metadata that something like input needs to do what you want to do, then maybe you're better off with a more simple solution or with a less complicated setup. It always depends on your production. And that means that it doesn't mean that one of these tools is the absolute best. It means that you have to look at what you want to achieve and which tool can achieve exactly that in the best way, and possibly has some expansion range if you plan on changing your workflow.
Yeah, and maybe it's a compromise. Maybe you need to buy a tool to do pre-flight and some other stuff. And oh, by the way, you also have workflows where imposing files could be interesting, or isn't, or has to be done. Maybe the compromise is that you look for something that can do both. And if you can use that for 2 or 3 years, and in 3 years from now you decide that you've outgrown that solution and you want to look at further options, why not? That's something that you have to decide. But you can't make that kind of decision unless you go through the exercise, at least for yourself, and maybe with a partner to help you with that. You have to go through the exercise of defining what your requirements are, what you want to do, and then look at the software that is available. Don't start with the software. You can look at all the movies we have. I don't mind. They're nice movies. So you can look at all the movies of the tools, but maybe that's not the best way of doing that. Maybe the best way is to find a partner who's implemented a bunch of that stuff. And whether it's us or someone else, I really don't care. But the best way might be finding a partner who's worked with a lot of these things, and just talk with them about what it is that you want to do. And once you know that, then start looking at the software solutions. It shouldn't always start with the software, I think. It should start with the business requirements and so on. Okay, I think that's more or less what we wanted to share. We're also we're not too late, because I said we had no idea how long this was going to take. Are there any questions that we need to answer, or were we just talking too much and no one dares to ask anything?
People fell asleep. There's not a lot of activity in chat, but ooh, me, pick me. What are we doing next week?
Oh, next week? That's actually a very good question. I think next week we're talking about pdfToolbox, if I'm not mistaken.
It's callas, license server, and all those kind of stuff, how to deploy.
So license options for scaling up pdfToolbox, and both from a technical and a commercial point of view, I think. And then the week after that, I think we're back to some kind of more of an overview session about bleed specifically, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And that is the last one before the summer holidays. So we have 2 more to go. No questions? No questions. Good. Then the only thing that I'm left with is thanking you all very much for joining. You can already subscribe to the upcoming ones. They are on our website, fourpees.com/events. So thank you for joining us. If you come up with specific questions later, just send us an email and we will get back to you, and then have a really nice end of the day. Goodbye.